right? And so, for a lot of folks, from where we stand right this minute, it kind of looks like private property is just like has always been there, right? And it's always been private property. It's always been the case that people owned land, but that actually isn't the case. It isn't true, and so it is really important in when we're in these struggles to have more equitable access to land and kind of achieve land and housing justice. To understand that this is actually a more recent history than what we're led to believe, right? And so that's why it's important to understand kind of the European history of private property, partly because that European kind of situation around private property was the system that was exported and violently imposed all around the world through colonization, right? And so there were many different things going on all around the world in terms of land, and it was the Europeans through colonization that really exported private property and imposed that violently on Indigenous populations across the globe. So basically, there was this series of events called the Enclosures, right? And they were really sort of this like critical threshold moment to understand in terms of private property. And I'm going to explain what the Enclosures were. But before the Enclosures, right, the system was like feudalism. And what that meant was, in terms of land, what that meant was that the people who kind of, let's call it owned land or kind of controlled land, they didn't have like this sort of full title to land that people have now, where like they have this massive set of rights when it comes to land. You couldn't like buy and sell land on the market, for example, like people do now. And there wasn't like these sort of land titles, like where you have like the title to the land and so forth. And the only one who could say they had like 100% absolute rights to the land was the king or queen, right? The monarch, right? So that was the system before the Enclosures. And then, we get to and this is like a bill of enclosure that you're seeing here. But so then, you get to the sort of it's like loosely the 1400s. And I think we can go to the next slide. And you have what's called the Enclosures, right? And the Enclosures is actually like a landlord, how like we talk about the tenant movement? The Enclosures is actually kind of like a landlord movement. And it started in the 1400s. And basically, folks who had controlled land, landlords, the lords of the land, they had previously shared that land with the folks, the working folks that were, what we would call like now the working class folks, right? The commoners is what they were called then. And commoners could work the land and would, the produce of working that land, some portion would go to the landlord and some portion would be kept by the commoners and so forth. And then there was certain land that was just pure common land that everyone could work on to make, to grow food and so forth. Anyway, so this was a really critical time in terms of creating private property as we understand it today. Although it's not like the very first time that property was private. There had been some private property before then, but like many hundreds of years before then. And then there was this period where like land was thought of differently under feudalism. It wasn't private. And then we went back to this private property through the Enclosures. And basically what happened is landlords basically wanted to say, well, I want to have full rights to this land. And there was a whole series over hundreds of years of physical and legal battles over land. And, there was like some physical side of it, right? Where landlords are literally building fences and hedges around land to like keep other people out of it, and physically enforcing through violence, kind of keeping other people out. And then, and then commoners would be tearing down the fences and so forth. And then there were like legal battles, right? Like we see today where, courts are being asked to decide like who has the superior claim to this land. And, mostly landlords, you can imagine mostly the landlords were winning. And so then there were lots of these like laws got passed, like you saw on that previous slide, where there were these little bills that were called Enclosure Acts that basically enclosed parcels of land, and privatized that land, right? And so, you can see here on the slide, sort of most of these laws came around like the 1700s and the early 1800s. But actually, by the time you get to that point, most of the land, say in England, had already actually been physically enclosed by some of these other kinds of fights, right, in courts and physically. And so, what that meant for folks, for common folks, right, and we can go to the next slide on this, what that meant was that they actually didn't have a way to access land to produce the things that they needed to live, right? Like to produce food, to, locate the house that you're living in, to produce like, the goods, like, like to have sheep that would give you wool to make clothes or whatever, right? Like they didn't have access to land to make and create all the things that they needed. And so what ended up happening was people were really forced into working for wages, right? And it's around this time that we have the Industrial Revolution and kind of this growing kind of working industry that needed workers, right? And so people, because of this sort of enclosures, people were really forced to participate in that and to become workers, right? And to work for whatever they could get, right? And so including very, very low wages. And then there were laws that were passed that really that criminalized homelessness, right? Or vagrancy, that made it like a criminal offense to not have a place to live and to not have a job and to be sort of moving around and so forth. And also around this time, what's happening is because of the enclosures, you end up with a land market, right? Because once people can actually own land, then they can exchange it, right, for money. And so you end up with, for the first time here, a land market where people are buying and selling land in the way that we know now. Like it feels very like, like it's been around forever. The real estate industry, right, of buying and selling land, it was created around this time, right, as a result of the enclosures. So this is like a really big monumental shift, right? Like for folks in terms of their relationship to land. And so it's not like the case anymore that, you're born in a place and your family works that land, and that's how you meet your basic needs for food and shelter and so forth, and that's where you stay, right? It's like a sort of sense of community and fixed and stable kind of relationship to the land. What this resulted in, all this sort of buying and selling and pushing people out, was like that people's relationship to land really shifted, right, and became much less stable. Okay, so what I've just described, right, and again, really fast, was going on in Europe. But yes, no, totally, we can go to the next slide because the next step, right, in all of this history is that we go from like this system of private land ownership that is being established in Europe, then gets, exported across the globe through conquest and settler colonialism, right, which goes about then violently imposing this system of private property in, the Americas and in Africa and in Australia and in all of these different places where, settler colonialism is taking place. And so, here, this is something, for all of us who do work in sort of the legal sector, the law was really like a key tool in making this happen, right? There was obviously very great degrees of physical, violence, genocide, and so forth, right? Like actually kind of a very violent process of imposing private property. But there was also the violence of the legal process, right? And all of these legal concepts that were like developed to justify taking the land from people, right, and pushing them off the land and excluding them from the land. And so you have things like this idea of discovery, right, and what's called terra nullius, right, these concepts of like that if people don't have private property, then they're not really occupying this land and owning this land in any way, and it's just ripe for the taking. We can just come along and pluck it off a tree like you would pluck an apple off a tree, right? It's just there and nobody really is claimed it, so we're going to claim it, right? And it doesn't matter how long you've been there. The law is going to say that, that because you weren't really cultivating the land according to the Europeans, because you weren't doing these different things with the land that we want to recognize, then we're just going to say that, our claims are superior and we're taking it. And so there was all of these different legal concepts used, and then legal systems developed to control and distribute the land, right? And these same systems, like the deed system and this thing called the torrens system, which is used in some states in the US and in various countries around the world, are the systems that were developed in this period to actually divide and control the land, right? So, I feel like, I have to say, obviously, this narrative around Indigenous peoples not cultivating the land, not improving the land, not kind of working the land was obviously, and not being settled on land was obviously, we now at least I can say was entirely false, right? Like, people had been cultivating land, they had built, had agriculture, were doing all these things, had built roads and pathways, which, here in New York City, for those who are in New York City, we still tread those pathways, many of them today. And so really what was happening there was, wealth and kind of that had been cultivated in the land by Indigenous peoples was just simply appropriated. And they were really basically conveniently pretending that the land was in this sort of natural, uncultivated, wilderness kind of state, when really that wasn't what was going on. Okay, so that's sort of like, how colonization kind of played into this question of private property. And, we did see, and I think this may be on the next slide, the idea of private property was also really used and was part of building these sort of nations, right? Colonial nations. And so, but there were all these different land grants to settlers, right, who were coming from Europe to the US and being granted parcels of land. And that both enriched those people and allowed them to build wealth, but it also meant you were displacing Indigenous folks who previously were living on that land, right? And so it was, it had a dual function, right? It was both to claim and settle land, and it was enriching the folks that were doing that. And, in the US, like, this idea of property ownership was very much tied to being a citizen, right? And so if you're trying to build a nation and a nation of citizens, then understanding what it means to be a citizen is really important. And property ownership was a critical part of that, right? And the very first US Civil Rights Act of 1866 was the one that articulated at the very first instance, like that citizens had a range of rights. And one of them was really about property, all about private property, and the right to buy and sell and lease and hold private property as the rights of a citizen. Okay, so, and then, obviously, if we're talking about the history of private property in the US, we have to talk about the history of slavery and how the labor of enslaved peoples was used to take the land that had been appropriated from Indigenous peoples and then turn that into like a source of wealth for the white colonizers. And so, like, that's really obvious when you look at southern plantations, right? Because it's just like a very obvious way in which land was appropriated and then used to generate massive amounts of wealth, in particular from cotton. But we don't have to go to the south to sort of see this. We can also see this, where we are now, in NYC, in New York City, in that slavery was also a critical part of what established New York City as the sort of the real estate and finance center that we know of as today. And so you had, enslaved people serving kind of these, fancy New York City households. There was, the labor of enslaved peoples was used to build the city, including, Wall Street and Trinity Church downtown. The cotton and sugar trade was really all kind of exporting through New York City as a major port. And so that was building wealth here, because you imagine there's all these different kind of industries and jobs and things that were going, and businesses and so forth that were surrounding that export trade. And then, of course, all the banks, right? The banks and insurers who were all profiting from the trade of enslaved peoples, including some names that you would recognize today, like Aetna and, JP Morgan. So slavery played a really key role in this history of private property as we know it today. And then finally, to sort of just touch on one last piece of this history, it's important to when we look at New York City, there's many ways in which, we've seen a lot of different transformations, and many of us would have seen a lot of transformations in the city, in terms of the way real estate and housing function in the city. But even though we've seen all these transformations, like, it does have a really long history of being fundamentally a real estate city. And so, when it was a Dutch colony, there were, many land grants to, names, families with names that you would recognize, like Chelsea and Murray and Fordham and Morrisania. And then later, Mayor Clinton levels Manhattan, John Jacob Astor is a fur trader. There was big trade in beaver fur, and became the first millionaire by buying up this land that had been leveled. And then, buying and leasing land becomes like this big business, right? And a lot of these names that you see on the slide here, Beekman, Rutgers, Stuyvesant, etc., were all folks who kind of engaged in this big business of buying and leasing land, and so and made tremendous amounts of wealth doing that. And so, so what I've just taken us through, and I know it's been very, very rapid, is that sort of history of private property, that is a more sort of distant history, shall we say. And we're going to talk more about other aspects of history, in particular around race, as we get further along. But, what we're going to maybe switch to now is just a little bit of a question for you all, actually, and we want to see if people could drop into the chat. Not all property is private. Historically, it hasn't all been, but even now, not all property is private. And so what are some alternatives that you could think about, that isn't private property? And that could be here, it could be in other countries. Drop some in the chat and let's have a look at what folks are thinking. Okay, sorry, that was me. I accidentally stopped the recording. I was trying to get to the chat, sorry. Yeah, people are putting a lot of things in. Libraries, like, so things owned by the city or the state, parks, community land trusts. It's great. I mean, if only there were a gazillion more, right? Like reserves, yeah, like wilderness reserves, community land trusts. Yeah, cool. Yeah, and obviously, I mean, this is sort of part of the struggle that people are engaged in, to see, can we take more and more things out of the realm of private property, right, and bring them into these other realms, because property being private, as you're going to see in these coming sections, is a big part of how exploitation around housing in terms of rents and deprivation around housing happen because it's private. Yeah, look, so we've got some more native land gift backs, roads, common use land. There's personal belongings, which is different. Property owned by the city. Cool, thank you. Okay, so I think I am gonna hand it over to Sam to continue presenting.
Great. One statistic that stuck in my head that I heard years ago is that a majority of the land mass of New York City is either publicly or nonprofit owned. And some of those nonprofits are better than others, but still, it's more than 50% if you think about all the streets and all the sidewalks and all the public land, and then all that's owned by nonprofits. So it's good to keep in mind that not everything is strictly for-profit private property, and we can expand that further. So Marika just gave us a really amazing and I think sobering history of how private property develops in Europe through colonization, through slavery, the folks who benefited from it in New York City. I'm going to give us some theoretical tools to think about how housing and private property works now, and also some sort of statistics and demographics to show how it plays out in New York City today. So oftentimes we talk about the commodification of housing when we're talking about what's going on in New York City today, with housing becoming so much more expensive and owned by fewer and fewer people. So I want to talk a little bit about what that means. A commodity is something that's put on the market to be bought and sold, right? If that's the case, then it has to have a value if it's going to be bought and sold. But in fact, it has two values. One is called a use value, which is why somebody wants or needs to have a thing and what they'll do with it. The other kind of value is called exchange value, which is how the thing is priced on the market now and in the future. So the first thing is about how useful it is. The second is about what it costs. And I'm sure we can think of many examples of any commodity that you might need, or that you might want, or you might use. There's what you pay for it, that's one value, and then there's why you want to use it, that's the other. When we talk about housing as a commodity, then we can think that that has a use value and an exchange value too. One way of thinking about what those values are is a phrase that comes from the historian Keeanga-Yamada Taylor, who says, the use value of housing is home, the exchange value of housing is real estate. The use value is home, the exchange value is real estate, but when housing is a commodity, it functions as both at the same time. And we can think then about landlord-tenant relations as, among other things, struggles over which of those two things is going to win out, use value or exchange value in housing. Housing commodification is language that is, maybe a little bit more recently used, but is not exactly a new thing. Housing in New York has been commodified for a very long time, as Marika just showed us. Similarly, people say housing is financialized now. It's become a financial product. Well, it's been that for a long time too, at least since the rise of the modern commercial mortgage in the 1930s, but really going back further, again, as Marika's history showed us, there's been a long tie between the finance industry and the real estate industry in New York City. So what's new about this moment? Certainly we have a deeper extent of commodification and financialization. When I say a deeper extent of commodification, I mean that real estate value is rising really fast, right? The use value of a home is kind of stable and constant. You need a home, you need a place. You have an emotional attachment to it, but the exchange value of it has just been shooting up over the last few decades. Similarly, it's been financialized for a long time. It's been incorporated with banks in the financial system through mortgages, but those mortgages have become more and more complex, more and more predatory, and more speculative over the last few years. Another change that's happened over the last few decades, really almost a century now, half a century at least, is the decline of other kinds of investment relative to those that are premised on owning a thing, in this case, owning real estate. So we have less of a manufacturing economy in New York City than we used to, for example. And when you have less of that kind of economy, the finance and real estate economy tends to get bigger. We have what you might call securitization of mortgages, which means not only do I have a mortgage, to own my theoretical home, but my bank has packaged that mortgage with a bunch of others and sold it to investors. And so that massively complicates the kind of field of housing economics and means there's a lot more money to be made. There's a lot more money to be lost. And then finally, we have different players getting into the housing game in New York City and elsewhere, which the planning scholar Benjamin Teresa calls the new tenement landlord. These are kind of big corporate firms, also hedge funds and predatory equity funds that are buying up working class people's housing under the theory that they can somehow make more money off of it than the traditional owners could. And I'm going to get into some of those mechanisms in a bit. But all this together kind of combines to be the commodification and financialization of housing that we're experiencing in New York. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about who owns and who rents. So New York City and the United States have basically a reverse ratio of tenants and owners. In the country as a whole, about 1/3 of the country are renters and 2/3 are homeowners. In New York City, however, about 2/3 are renters and 1/3 are owners. So it's the reverse of the national trend. Most of those New York City owners are co-op and condo owners. Some of them are single family homeowners, but most of them are not landlords per se. We talk about who tenants are. We can break it down by race. 59% of white New Yorkers are tenants. 61% of Asian New Yorkers are tenants. 72% of Black New Yorkers are tenants. And 83% of Hispanic or Latinx tenants, New Yorkers are tenants. So it's a pretty wide discrepancy. Tenants are very deeply and widely rent burdened, which I think we all know. That means they're paying a large amount of their income in rent. We say that a tenant is rent burdened if they're paying more than 30% of their income. That applies to more than half of the tenants in New York City. So paying unaffordable rents is the norm. For 1/3 of tenants, people are paying what we call severely high rent burdens. They're paying more than half of their income to rent. And I like to imagine this as a situation where your landlord takes a majority of the money your boss gives you every month. That's what it means to be severely rent burdened. The average tenant's income is $56,000, which is below the average income generally in New York City. But there's also a wide discrepancy in that. In Manhattan, the average tenant's income is $80,000. In the Bronx, it's $34,000. And I could be wrong, but I think those are household incomes, not individual incomes. So what about the landlords? This is a bit of a question mark. We don't have a census of landlords the way that we have a census of all New Yorkers, most of whom are tenants. We do have some data, however, which suggests that very large landlords own large shares of the housing stock. So it is disproportionately large and very large landlords, meaning landlords who own more than 20 buildings, who control the housing stock in New York City. So that 1/3 of homeowners that I talked about before, it's not like all of them are landlords. It's really a relatively small group who owns the rental housing stock in New York. A lot of them are also hiding exactly who they are through what's called limited liability corporations, LLCs, which makes it harder to know who's behind the ownership of a building. It might just be the address of a building LLC. But if you do a little bit of research, you might figure out that it has the same address as an owner who owns 50 other buildings. So we have a kind of mythology of the small landlord, but in practice, it's a relatively rare, relatively small part of the New York City real estate market. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about rent. What exactly is rent? One definition of rent is the one that we use kind of colloquially, most commonly, which is it's what tenants pay the owner of a building for access to space, right? That's like saying every month I pay the rent. There are other ways that we talk about rent, though, and an important one is the way economists talk about rent. They call this economic rent. And to pull from this definition, it means an amount of money earned that exceeds that which is economically or socially necessary. An amount of money earned that exceeds that which is economically or socially necessary. So for economists, rent means money that a person can command simply because they own a thing and other people need it, not because they need that money in order to, run the thing. So if we think of that in terms of housing, the rent is all the extra money that the tenants pay on top of what's necessary to keep the property up and running. Economists call that the unearned increment, because the landlord doesn't really do anything to deserve that money. They don't need it to run the property. They just get it because they can. We also have what economists call monopoly rents, which is like an even more narrow band than the economic rent, or an even more exploitive form than the economic rent. So monopoly rents are economic rents derived from monopolies, which can result from either denial of access to an asset or the unique qualities of an asset. So what does this mean? It means that when one small group of people own a thing, they can charge higher prices for it. That's what a monopoly is. And they control that thing either because they deny access to other people, as in through some of the racist history of land ownership that we're going to hear about in the next section, or simply because it's so expensive and wages don't keep up with those costs. Or definition 2, the unique qualities of an asset, which is to say, if somebody owns property just south of Central Park, no one else can own that lot. One person owns it and it is, phenomenally valuable, and they can charge a lot of money because nobody else can have access to that territory. So this to me is, maybe a richer idea of what rent is, and something we can think about every time we have to pay the rent and every time we're counseling a tenant who has to pay the rent, that what they're actually paying for is not just what's needed to run the property, but an economic rent, and in a lot of cases, a monopoly rent on top of it. How are rents determined in New York City? This is a hard question to answer because the answer depends on the housing type and the regulatory regime. But we can think of it, there being 3 types of rent setting mechanisms, all active in New York City at the same time. One we might call social rent, which is to say people pay what they can afford. Their rent is based on their income. In the current system, usually it's people pay 30% of their income. In earlier times, it's been 25% or 20%. So it's important to note that that's a politically determined figure. But whatever the figure is, you can have a social rent where it's different for different people depending on what they can afford. Examples of housing that runs like this is public housing, NYCHA housing, most voucher systems like Section 8 vouchers, housing that's financed through the low-income housing tax credit usually, Mitchell-Lama housing, Mitchell-Lama rentals, you pay 30% of your income, and many inclusionary housing schemes as well, like MIH. So that's social rents. There's variation within those, but that's the basic idea. The next form of rent setting is regulated rents. This is where the change in rent from year to year is going to be determined by a city or a state authority, like the Rent Guidelines Board for rent stabilized properties. HCR determines the rent increase for rent controlled properties. But it's essentially a political determination which landlords and tenants are fighting for either lower or higher increases based on what happened over the year. And finally, you have what is maybe erroneously called free market rents, which is when the rent is set by the landlord at the prices they bet the market will bear. The landlord sets the rent as high as they think somebody will pay for it. And examples of this are basically non-rent stabilized, non-subsidized, non-public housing. And these are usually newer buildings that aren't subsidized or tax breaked, or smaller buildings that are, or buildings or apartments that have been taken out of rent stabilization or other regulatory systems over the years. What is that rent supposed to cover, right? So we talked about different ways that rent is set, but what is it actually supposed to pay for? The heat in the building, the water, supposed to pay the taxes to the extent that the landlord anyway is supposed to pay the taxes. They might have a tax break. It's supposed to pay for routine maintenance, everyday stuff in a building, but also structural repairs, deeper fixes that have to happen every so often, and emergency maintenance when there's a problem, like flooding after a hurricane or heavy rain. It also pays for labor costs for supers and other folks who work in the building. But it also pays for a lot of other things. And in a lot of for-profit rental buildings, the rent is paying the landlord's profit and it's subsidizing their debts. Landlords' profits are realized, they're made by raising the net operating income in a building, which means reducing the expenses, how much it costs to operate, and raising revenues, which would be rents from tenants, residential and commercial, but also other forms of revenue. And then they use financing to translate that into windfall profits. So what does that mean? We have a little chart here that's from a report that came out from the Community Service Society about a year ago that shows how some of this works, and I can get into it in the Q&A, but the basic story is landlord buys a building, landlord increases their net operating income, either by decreasing the services or raising the rents or both. Landlord goes back to the bank and says, hey, my building is actually worth more now because I've made it more profitable, and because land and buildings are just becoming more profitable in this city as a whole as it gentrifies, I want to refinance my mortgage, and I want you to give me all the money back as a windfall profit, and then I'll have a new debt to you. So at the end of this scheme, the landlord has taken home a pile of money from the bank, and yes, they owe money, but they pay that money off with the tenant's rents. So the tenants are subsidizing the landlord's ability to pull equity out of the building. This is probably the most fundamentally hidden and unjust and also lucrative ways that landlords make money off of buildings. It's not just the monthly rents, it's their ability to turn those monthly rents into huge amounts of debt, which the tenants are essentially on the line for more than the building. Okay, so that's the end of my section. I want to pose a question for folks to answer, which is, what consequences of housing being a commodity do you see in your work or in your community? And you can put this in the chat, I'll read it again. What consequences of housing being a commodity do you see in your work or in your community? Oh, and thanks, Yvonne, for putting our report in there too. Right, so bad work being done, ice cold windows, homelessness everywhere, absolutely. Rising rents, costs going up, unsafe living conditions. And I think the key thing is to see these two things hand in hand. We have homelessness, we have bad conditions because some people are making a lot of money off of housing. It's the two go one and together, they're not separate issues. Landlord harassment, lack of repairs, disinvestment, absolutely. Disinvestment and gentrification are often two sides of the same process, and we're going to get into that later on in our talk. I will pass it back to Marika now, who's going to get into the racist history and present of housing.
Oh, thank you, Sam. And yeah, feel free to keep dropping in the chat. It's all good. Okay. So what I'm going to talk us through, for there's a sort of pretty short kind of sections for topics that are actually much bigger. And I do think once we circulate the reading list, you'll see a lot of material on the pieces that I'm about to cover that we would really recommend you take some time to read and digest. If this is the work that you're in, it's really important to understand kind of the racism inherent in this systems and underpinning them. Okay, so to go to the first slide, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about, really race has, at all times, I think it's fair to say in US history, controlled or determined like people's access to land and housing, right? Or their lack of access to land and housing. And also the terms and the quality of that access to housing and land. And so it's really essential, when you're trying to understand kind of how these relationships around land and housing work in the US and have worked over the years. It's really important to examine that in terms of race. And so I'm going to talk about sort of, I guess, 5 key aspects of this. One is migration. Another is sort of segregation and exclusion. Another is exploitation. The 4th one is disinvestment, and as Sam was saying, the flip side, investment, and then finally disposability. Right. And so these are sort of like 5, what I would say. And this is just my way of sort of organizing the information. It's not any kind of fancy formula or anything. But, what I would say are sort of 5 key buckets or kind of facets that we can examine to sort of understand how race is sort of operating in this and has operated in terms of land and housing. And so, migration is a critical one, right? Because I think, for us in New York City, but this is also true, across the nation, migration has really shaped kind of neighborhoods and the types of housing that we see in the neighborhoods and the prices of the housing and so forth, right? And so, at the earlier stages, what this looked like was sort of European migration and the creation of tenement housing. I know you all are familiar with lots of different struggles that occurred in tenement housing, and also different laws that emerged in response to struggles in tenement housing around health and in particular our housing maintenance code. So that's one aspect of migration. Another is what sort of people might call domestic migration, or migration within sort of the boundaries of the nation state and its territories. Black migration from the South, Puerto Rican migration, and then obviously also international, migration across borders. And so, what this led to is really, a city that is in some ways a city of different migrant neighborhoods, right? Neighborhoods like Harlem, during the Great Migration, Bushwick, Sunset Park, basically the whole of the South Bronx is sort of migrant neighborhoods, Flushing, Jackson Heights in Queens, neighborhoods that we really, very deeply understand as being migrant neighborhoods. And what this has also led to is certain types of housing that can be identified with certain migrant communities, right? And whether that's, basements in Queens or, day laborers in Staten Island who commonly live in illegal subdivides, in private homes, to different opportunities that there's been for migrant home ownership in, say, the Bronx and Queens. And I guess, it's important to also highlight the flip side of that. And I guess public housing is another one of those, right? Which, originally was intended to be a way for white working class folks to build wealth and transition into home ownership, but later became predominantly housing for Black and brown folks, migrants, right? From whether that was from the South or from Puerto Rico or wherever. And then, the flip side of this is, of course, migration away from New York City, which has also shaped our city, right? And so that white flight that occurred in the 50s in particular, where, white folks were moving from the city into the suburbs, and were incentivized to do that through a range of different home ownership programs, as well as sort of cultural emphasis on the, this idea of the American dream and what that meant, and associating that with, owning a home in the suburbs. So migration has really shaped in a lot of ways people's relationship to land and housing in the city that we live in. Then, segregation and exclusion, right? And so, I don't think, I need to tell any of you all, but, the market that we're all talking about, this housing market, is incredibly racist, and has been from the get-go. And so, our system of sort of valuing land and housing, and therefore like being able to identify like its profitability, this thing that Sam was talking about, its exchange value in certain ways, has mostly been defined in terms of proximity to and the presence of Black communities, right? Not just Black communities, Black and brown, but predominantly Black folks, right? And so, what we have seen over the years is a whole kind of array of different policies that attempt to maximize the ability for landlords and developers to profit from land, by using race as their basis. And so it's been a combination of the law and violence and public and private partnerships where the state kind of works with private actors or ignores their abuses. But all of this has been, done to sort of orchestrate a segregation or exclusion in order, in part, to maximize the values of land in other places, right? And so if we can go to the next slide, we'll see some of those policies, right? And we don't have time to sort of dig into what all of these things are. And there are a number of really great books on the reading list that we'll share that you could really dig into to understand these. And yeah, so recommend that you have a look. It's the reading list is divvied up into sections, so you should be able to identify those books pretty easily. But here are some of the policies, right? Like redlining to impede certain folks from accessing home ownership. And obviously the flip side of that, which isn't listed here, but was the different opportunities for white home ownership that were created at exactly the same time. Urban renewal, right? That took kind of Black and brown neighborhoods, I mean, literally took them, and excluded the people that were living there, and changed those neighborhoods into something entirely different, right? And obviously a really commonly used example is like Lincoln Center, for example, but there are many others, and displacing thousands and thousands of Black and brown people as a result. Racial covenants, which are basically like legal tools to basically say people cannot live on particular parts of land, like can't own particular tracts of land if they're of particular races. Discrimination has been used. What we call blockbusting, which is a technique used by the real estate industry to inflate the values of properties and to sort of skew the market in ways that would be enriching, by relying on white fear of Black and brown folks, and white fear that Black folks would come in and lower the property values, and using that to get quick sales by white folks and take those properties and so forth. Actual violence, has been commonly used, and still is exhibited by white communities, to keep Black and brown folks out of certain neighborhoods and certain areas. And then, of course, as I was saying earlier, the flip side of this sort of these policies, that are really these sort of violent kind of exclusionary policies, are the ways that the state creates policies to include and like encourage white home ownership and white renters and so forth, right? And all of that combines to create this dynamic of segregation and exclusion along racial lines. So then to the next slide, we, another facet, another key facet has been this sort of predatory exploitation, right? So, we're gonna let you in, you can come and rent here, but we're going to exploit you while you do, right? And that, has taken a bunch of different forms, right? There were the predatory deed sales where people were, predated upon and exploited in deed sales when they were trying to access home ownership. And that predominantly affected Black folks. Slumlords, which we see right now, right? Like overcharges, fees, really racking up lots and lots and lots of fees for all sorts of minor things, terrible housing conditions, higher rents have oftentimes been a factor of sort of living in Black and brown neighborhoods where people are actually paying more for less in terms of the conditions and type of housing that they're getting. The location of housing near what they call unwanted uses, right? So the way that the city has kind of located housing that is predominantly for Black and brown folks near things like electrical power stations and sanitation stations and so forth, and also in somewhat dangerous areas in terms of the ecology, right? Like the environment, so near like the waterfront, near where there's like environmental hazards. And then subprime mortgages was another good example, right? Where the kind of disinvestment in Black and brown neighborhoods kind of rendered properties basically subprime, right? And created a situation in which, in order to buy those properties, people had to access a sort of a market for mortgages that was more risky, that cost more, and that ultimately led to, massive financial collapse. Okay, and then to move along to the next slide, disinvestment, right? So in addition to kind of this exploitation, what we've also seen is like a sort of massive disinvestment in neighborhoods along racial lines, right? And in New York City, we saw this really acutely in the 70s with the bankruptcy crisis, where the city is like actively withdrawing services and amenities from neighborhoods of color, and in some part of this culminated in the burning of the South Bronx. And Sam is going to talk about this later, but this disinvestment is part of this sort of cycle of gentrification, right? And so when we're thinking about sort of the racialized dynamics here, what this disinvestment and kind of depriving people of essential services and amenities and so forth turns into is a chance for somebody else to later profit massively from that. And of course, again, you always, have to look at that flip side, right? And so the flip side of this disinvestment is like at the same time as the city is sort of pulling resources and not investing in Black and brown communities, there is also at the same time, investment in white communities in the form of infrastructure and amenities and kind of pumping money into the private market through subsidies and tax breaks for white developers and so forth. So, and so that investment is also occurring along racial lines. And then finally, just to touch on one final aspect of this that I think is important to kind of consider is just this kind of attitude or kind of policy of disposability, right? That communities of color are in some senses disposable, that they can be displaced for gentrification and that's okay. That people can be evicted, that people can be subject to kind of buyout campaigns and harassment and construction as harassment and, all of these things that suggest like a kind of a lack of caring about whether that community is there or not there, right? A disposability. Similarly, we saw this with around the rezonings, right? And the level of rezonings that have taken place, in particular upzonings that have taken place in communities of color, working class communities of color, to further gentrification. We've also seen kind of just criminalization, right? And this, I think, particularly evidently in public housing, right? Through the war on drugs and mass incarceration, and the way that public housing and being a public housing tenant, or being even just present on public housing grounds, has come to be criminalized, right? and that then leading to massive numbers of people being incarcerated and seen as disposable, and it's okay if they're, incarcerated en masse. And then finally, this point that I was mentioning earlier around a kind of lack of caring, a sense of disposability around where you locate housing for low-income Black and brown folks, right? And that it's fine to put it, where a hurricane could destroy it or what have you, right? Or where it's going to be on the waterfront and have constant issues around mold and damp and, cold and so forth. And so that's, I think another key facet of that. And obviously with the climate crisis, that is going to continue to become more and more of an issue for folks who are living in those zones, right? Okay, so this has been like a real kind of, again, very rapid kind of overview of the different ways that racism and race have impacted housing. Just as a sort of a quick question to hear from you all a little bit, can you drop in the chat perhaps, like what are the kinds of racism in housing that you see in your work or in your community? What are some things you see today that are examples of that? And I think it's going to take folks a minute to write something like this because it takes a little bit of a longer question. I bet that all lost everybody. Oh no, here we go. Right. Riverside Park, the sewer treatment. And, that's a really interesting example too, right? Because there's some pieces where, like Riverside Park, as far as I understand, like the history there is that the park itself was sort of the trade-off for the sewer treatment plant, right? So like you only get parks and nice things like that if you take something like a sewer treatment plant or whatever in that neighborhood, as opposed to other neighborhoods which will just get parks just because that's a nice thing to have for people. Gentrification, people becoming homeless, where the city focuses on flood prevention, voucher discrimination, yeah, absolutely, rezonings, right, the language access and management staff not being multilingual. Deed theft is still an issue. Vouchers as income discrimination. Yeah. Food deserts, policing, truck routes is another one. Good point. Pollution, like these are all kind of, housing issues. And some of these intersections, right, between race and disability and other things. Yeah, vouchers is a big one. Yeah, and look, healthcare, schools, exactly. So like housing, to the extent that race impacts the kind of housing you can access, it then impacts everything else, right? Because where you live is fundamentally tied then to like your access to food, to healthcare, to schools, to everything else. And so it then has like this flow-on effect. Great, thank you. These are all really, really helpful. Yeah. And then, this is interesting too. Somebody's put in a point about how landlords will sort of focus on tenants from particular countries who may feel are less likely to enforce their tenant rights. And so it's it's that sort of predatory kind of approach, right? And I think it's important to always remember all of this works because of the stuff that Sam was talking about, right? Like you can do all of this, you can, select your tenants in this way because housing is a commodity, it's private property that can be used to make money, right? If you can exploit people in the right ways. And so race becomes like a way to enable and kind of expand on that exploitation. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you. I'm going to pass it back to Sam for our next portion.
Great. And I think this discussion of racism and housing and exploitation leads really clearly into the question of cycles of gentrification. Gentrification is a really important aspect of housing struggles in New York City right now. And we're going to talk about how and why and where it happens and how it's connected to its opposite, which is disinvestment. So first, what is gentrification? There's a lot of different definitions out there. Might as well use my own. So I've defined it as the process by which capital is reinvested in urban neighborhoods and poorer residents and their cultural products are displaced and replaced by richer people and their preferred aesthetics and amenities. So it's a process of capital reinvestment, of displacement of the poor and replacement with wealthier people. How does this impact tenants? We talk about three forms of displacement that can result from gentrification, which are a little bit different from each other. The first and simplest is direct displacement, which is a tenant who's forced to move because their landlord is either going to tear down the building and replace it with something that will generate higher rents, or get them out, renovate the apartment and charge more for it, or possibly combine it with other apartments that are now larger and can command higher rents. But either way, the landlord is pushing out the tenant who lived there in order to make more money off of the property. That's direct displacement. Next to direct displacement, you can also have secondary or indirect displacement, which is sort of the displacement that results from direct displacement happening nearby. So when you live nearby places that are going through that form of demolition, reconstruction, renovation, you might see your rent rise as well, which could result in higher rent burdens. And perhaps you can't take the rent burden anymore. And so you move on to another home, possibly another neighborhood altogether. And even if you stay, the costs of basic goods might go up in addition to your rent. And so your same income is no longer worth as much because the grocery stores that sold the cheap groceries have been replaced by the grocery stores that sell the expensive groceries. The laundromats are going out of business because the assumption is that all these new condo owners have laundry in their apartment. And so now you have to schlep longer to a laundromat a few blocks away, or take a cab or something like that. And it all adds up in terms of time and money. Finally, we have something that's a little bit more obscure called tertiary displacement or third level displacement, which is when maybe you are stable. Let's say that you live in public housing or you have a voucher, or you're in rent stabilized housing and your landlord isn't able to raise the rent, but everything around you has changed to the point that you feel dislocated, even though you've stayed put. Your life world is gone, right? The people who are around you, who are important to you, your friends and family, informal economies, ways of caring for each other and each other's families, cultural ties to a place, accessibility to food that's culturally important to you, and other things like that are all gone. And so you might stay there, but you feel like you've been displaced because everything around you has. So these are three different ways of thinking about the impacts of gentrification on tenants. But basically, makes life more expensive, and a lot of people have to move. There's another way of understanding gentrification that's related to the definition that I gave before. And I guess I'm doing a lot of this, but I'm quoting myself here again to describe gentrification as the end of a longer process. So not only is gentrification a process in and of itself, it's the third stage in a longer process. Specifically, gentrification is the third stage in a long-term process of capital flow in and out of space. First comes investment in a built environment. Second, neighborhood disinvestment and property abandonment. And third, reinvestment in that same place for greater profits. That third stage, reinvestment, is when the gentrification can happen. But these are three stages of capital investment, disinvestment, and reinvestment in the same place over a long period of time, usually about like 75 to 100 years. And we have here a chart from the same report that I showed a little bit earlier that shows landlords, if they know what they're doing, can make money on each of those stages. They can make money off of investment. They can even make money off of disinvestment, and they can certainly make money off of reinvestment and the gentrification that comes along with it. So why do these three phases occur when and where they do? Why does the initial investment happen when it does and where it does? Why does that place then become disinvested? And then why is it reinvested and gentrified? So first, the initial investment. Why do developers and landowners put money into building up the housing stock in a particular location? And the first one I have here, first answer I have to that question is proximity to economic activity. So they invest in a certain place because it is near something else. It is near a job center, a place where there's industrial activity or financial activity, and therefore people want to live there. The important thing about this is that it places housing and real estate as secondary, right? There's already an economy happening in a place, and that's why there would be increased investment in building up housing there, because somebody else has already invested in business and other kinds of economic and social things in that place. The second reason we often have for why places are initially invested is that infrastructure has been expanded. This is usually public infrastructure, and you can think of it as all the stuff that needs to be there for a place to be inhabitable and for you to be able to get anywhere else. So water lines, electrical grids, these days internet lines, also roads and rail systems, transportation networks. Once those go up, that becomes a place where not only do people want to live, but whoever owns the land there can make a lot of money by turning it into housing for people who need to be in that place. The key to both of these is that the landowner didn't do the thing, right? The landowner who benefits from the investment did not put the economic activity nearby. They did not themselves build out the infrastructure. Those things are done by others, by the state, by other capitalists, but they benefit from it. So that's why investment happens initially. Why then would the same place undergo disinvestment several decades later? One reason to think about this at maybe the most macro level is that we always have uneven development in regions, in countries, and in the world. There is money that goes into some places at a given time and out of another. If we think about this in terms of urban neighborhoods that we might be familiar with, when those neighborhoods underwent disinvestment, there was probably someplace else not even that far away that was seeing a new round of new investment. So if you think about the kind of investment or disinvestment that New York City saw in the sort of beginning of in the, let's say, the late 60s, early 70s, that got really severe by the late 70s and early 80s. That was happening as neighboring suburban regions were being invested, right? So money was coming out of the city and it was going to other places. There was not a sort of even spread of investment in the cities and in the suburbs at the same time. And so you often see this seesaw effect where landowners can make more money, possibly because infrastructure has been expanded to a new place, like the federal highway system that made it possible for suburbanization to happen, and possibly because jobs are leaving. We had deindustrialization in New York City during that same period, and some of those jobs went not just to the south and to other countries, but to suburban or ex-urban areas of the region. And so as those jobs went out there, investment opportunities for housing chased it and left behind neighborhoods in New York City. You also have government policy, though, which is exactly what Marika just showed us with things like those redlining maps. That was not really the government's idea. That was government following what the banking industry was already doing and what it wanted to see codified into law. But still, once the government did it, it became a very powerful force, reinforcing the ideas that some neighborhoods, those red and yellow neighborhoods, would see structural disinvestment. As the building stock got older, the owners of it could not get mortgages to refinance and to put in money for repairs. And so the housing stock quality would go down, even as they were drawing as much rent as they could from tenants in them. And so you have government policy that incentivizes disinvestment in certain places and investment in others. In that map that Marika showed of Brooklyn, you might have noticed a lot of red and a lot of yellow, but there were also plenty of blue areas, which were getting more mortgage investment, and one green area. And that one green area was the Shore Road area of Bay Ridge, which the bankers really wanted to build up as a mansion district. And so they basically worked the system to ensure that it got a green line, even as a lot of central Brooklyn got the red line. So why do we have reinvestments and gentrification? There are economic factors, social factors, and political factors to explain this. On the economic factors, one way of explaining why a neighborhood goes from disinvestment to reinvestment, one theory for it is called the rent gap theory. In the simplest terms, what the rent gap theory says is when a landlord figures out that they can get more money by changing a property, by either taking it from multiple apartments into one single family home, in the case of like a brownstone in Brooklyn and other parts of the city, or by fixing up the apartment, or by knocking it down and building something new. They calculate the cost of that action versus the amount of money they can make on it once richer people move in. And so if the landlord believes that the gap is big enough between what current tenants pay and what future tenants will pay, or what current owners pay and what future owners will pay, to justify that investment that it takes to fix up a building or to knock it down and build something else, then they will. But they are waiting for that moment. They're waiting for the moment where it makes economic sense to invest a bunch in that building again, because there's somebody who will purchase it or rent at a high enough rate to pay them back for it. So that's the rent gap theory. But we also have the kind of deregulation and financialization of housing happening at the same time, or possibly following after the rent cap, which is to say that, I guess this gets into the political factors a little bit, but the rules change to allow landlords to get out of things like rent control and rent stabilization, which is absolutely necessary if they're going to close that rent gap. If they're going to take the rent from a low rent to a high rent, they need to be able to get out of rent stabilization or undermine it in one way or another. And so political changes to the rent control laws enabled that to happen. But you also have financialization, which I talked about earlier, as the way that landlords can use banking and finance to pull equity out of buildings, and also the way that banks can pool mortgages together and make a lot of money off of it. All of that, like I said before, increased the amount of money you could lose on housing, but also the amount of money you could make on housing, which immediately flew open that rent gap. Now there's a lot more money to be made. We also have the concentration of economic growth in fewer and fewer cities in this country and in many other countries. So as this goes along with the uneven development idea, but as certain economies in cities around the country are going bust, Detroit maybe is a classic example, others are booming. New York and San Francisco are maybe the most extreme examples. And when that happens, a lot of people with higher wages, higher salaries are moving to those fewer and fewer places. And whoever owns the land then has the ability to command a much higher rent as long as they can get around the laws that regulate housing. So that's a factor as well. That goes right hand in hand with the social factors, as in migration to job growth. So as that job growth is concentrated, like I said, more and more middle and upper income people are moving to those cities. They're moving into the neighborhoods where poorer people lived before, and they're able to pay more for it, and the landlords know it, and there's nothing on the laws to stop them, or they can skirt the laws in various ways if they don't have good lawyers. I also wrote social and cultural trends here as a way of thinking also about the idea that things have changed in the way that, let's say, young people assessing their own success think about where they want to live, right? So whereas there was a time not that long ago when a person would think, I've made enough money, now I'm going to leave the city. There are a lot of people who are now thinking, I've made enough money, I'm going to move to the city. And that dynamic changes, who is living where and how much they're willing to spend for it. Next, of course, there are political factors, and I'm going to save that for the next section, which is all about the role of government in the system of housing and rent. But before we go in there, a question for everybody. Please drop in the chat. Where do you think New York City is today in the long-term cycle of real estate boom, euphoria, crisis, and recovery? I'm going to go back to this image here, which showed that cycle. A real estate boom when there's a bunch of money coming in, euphoria where they're just making money on top of money, crisis where suddenly the owners of property are losing money, and then recovery as they're coming back. This is a complicated question to think about right now, since we don't know where we are in the pandemic, we don't know where we are in the recovery, but where do you think we are? Boom, euphoria, crisis, recovery. So we've got boom, boom, crisis, recovery, euphoria. We now have the full range covered, to which I would say you could make the argument for each of these. And we could make it more complex and say that some neighborhoods are in different parts of this at different times. So there might be parts of New York City which are in the euphoria stage where the prices are just unheard of. And there are other parts that are, crisis is a little strong, but edging in that direction. Okay, I am going to continue now, and I think I'm doing the first section of this one, and then I'm going to pass it to Marika. So now we're talking about the role of the state. And by the state, we don't just mean New York State, we mean the government, which could be New York City government, New York State government, federal government, some international regulators, though I don't think we're getting into that. And the role of the state in setting the dynamics of housing, real estate, and rent have to do with regulation. They have to do with land use. They have to do with police and eviction. I'm going to talk about the first two, about regulation and land use, and then Marika's going to talk about police and evictions. Okay, so what public policies have enabled gentrification in New York City? Here are kind of 5 big picture answers to that question, and it's by no means exhaustive. So one public policy that has enabled gentrification in New York City is the retrenchment of the rent laws and the non-enforcement of rent laws. What we mean by retrenchment is the state, because our rent laws are written at the state level, adding all sorts of loopholes to the rent laws that enable landlords to either continue raising rents pretty fast or ultimately take apartments out of rent stabilization altogether. When we talk about non-enforcement, that's when agencies like HCR are either extremely slow or loath to actually enforce the laws. And the fact that most of the regulation falls on the tenant to figure out that there's been a problem in the first place and to take it to HCR to take action. We had major improvements in the rent laws in 2019 through the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, which reversed the trend of rent law retrenchment, though there's more work to be done on that front. And there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of getting enforcement of that law that we passed 2 years ago now. A second way that we've enabled gentrification in New York City is public housing neglect. The systematic and long-term underfunding of public housing and the imposition of rules on public housing authorities that do not apply to other forms of housing owners that make it harder to operate good quality housing as it should be. And not only does this make public housing vulnerable to private takeovers, to demolition and other things, but it also whittles away public faith in the idea of public housing. And whenever that happens, the landlords gain power. They gain the power of the imagination of the public that they are the only way out of our problems. We also have expiring subsidies and privatization, which is the fact that a lot of our affordable housing programs, not all of them, but a lot of them, are time limited. And they can expire, and in many cases, they can be renewed. if the landlord opts to do that. There can be public financing to keep them affordable. But the landlord, in many cases, has the option to take them out of affordability. In some co-ops, the co-op can vote to take it out of affordability after a certain amount of time, and then it's privatized. And whoever owns it gets a windfall profit, and we lose the ability to have long-term affordable housing in our city, or we end up spending a ton of public money to keep the landlords in the system. Neither option is ideal. But we've seen the whittling away of previous generations' attempts to have housing that is based on social rents or regulated rents over the years. We also have tax incentive programs that are subsidizing gentrification. We have the J51 program, for example, which can be a subsidy for genuinely affordable housing, but can also be a subsidy for landlords to, basically not pay their taxes while they're also commanding higher rents in some cases. The big one, though, is 421A, which is the single largest housing program in terms of how much money is put toward it in New York City. More than New York City or the federal government pays toward public housing, more than New York City or the federal government pays toward vouchers or new nonprofit housing, we put toward this gigantic tax break for new development, the vast majority of which is not affordable. And the only affordable housing that comes out of it is usually cross-subsidized with another form of subsidy. This also is time limited, so even that affordable housing can be put at risk. We spent $1.7 billion on this, by the way, last year, $1.7 billion. So anytime they tell us we don't have enough money for housing, we should remember that we forewent $1.7 billion to luxury developers last year alone. And then finally, we have various kinds of rezonings, which Marika touched on earlier. These are changing the rules of land use, changing the rules about what can be built where. And we've seen a pattern of this where primarily working class, majority people of color neighborhoods get targeted as the places that will absorb the city's growth. So the places that will have a lot of new development, largely at market rates. Meanwhile, there are quasi-suburban homeowner, majority white neighborhoods in the city that the city only downzones or restricts new development. So you see both happening at the same time. All of these things enable the private capture of public investment in neighborhoods. Remember earlier when I talked about how the landlords benefited from the initial investment that was done, by the public in creating infrastructure and creating jobs nearby and creating culture that makes people want to live in a place. Well, whenever we do any of these 5 things, we enable whoever it is who owns the land to benefit even more from those public investments and public production of culture, production of life in the city that whoever it is owns the land gets to profit from. Okay, I'm going to pass it on to Marika now to talk about the coercive arm of the state and all
this. Yes, I will do. And it's interesting you saying that, Sam. It's sort of, you had talked about that private capture in earlier portions. I also talked about it in terms of the way that colonizers captured for private wealth, the improvements that Indigenous folks had made on the land, those kinds of investments that they had made in their communities and in the land. In some ways, it's interesting, like even some of the other pieces in the race section, like it just feels like there's this recurring theme in some ways of, as a result of the creation of private property, private actors being able to capture from the public, basically, and even just the original enclosures in some ways, these were lands that the commoners had cultivated, right, and had been tending to, and that was the original kind of private capture. So it is like a really a key kind of theme if you're in this work to kind of be paying attention to the ways that private actors are able to capture that value and then make it their own and then build on it to create more and more wealth. And then the way that the state enables that. And so, so this portion is looking at really kind of the more overtly violent side of that, although I would say all of these have, dimensions of violence to them. This piece that I'm about to embark on is the kind of more overtly violent part, where we're looking at how the state enforces sort of private property, right? How it enforces those private property rights. And so, first and foremostly, I think it's probably clear to all of us, right, that landowners, folks who own land, have state backing to enforce the kind of that what we call a bundle of rights that constitutes private property, right? So those different rights that you have when you own property, in order to enforce those rights, it's not you individually kind of standing guard to, deal with all of the different things that could happen. The state is playing a role of standing guard for you, right? And saying, we'll enforce your rights or help you to enforce your rights if anyone impinges on it. So it basically means that if you're a landowner, you have the backing of the state's sort of monopoly on violence, shall we say, the way that the state can actually enforce things against people by threat of violence. You have access to that, right, as a landlord. And there's a bunch of different ways that occurs, right? And so one way is through criminal laws that we have, right? So we have a whole range of different criminal laws that criminalize conduct related to that would be conduct impinging on what we understand to be private property rights, right? And so like obvious examples of those are like trespass or property damage or breaking and entering, just crimes that we have created where the thing that the person is doing is impinging on somebody else's property rights, right? And the state is saying, I'm gonna help you, landowner, and enforce those rights using my cops and my courts and my jails and so forth, right? The criminalization of squatting, right, is another example of that. There's also a bunch of different laws that enforce private property that aren't criminal, right? Like, we have a whole set of laws that address issues between parties, between people, whether that's between landowners, right, between each other. I own this bit of land. No, actually, that part of it's mine. And the state comes in and says, I'm going to help decide this dispute, right, with my courts. Or, landlord, has a property, but the state wants to take part of that land and use it to do something for the community, right? Like this idea of eminent domain. And then the state creates an apparatus, the courts, to help decide those disputes, right? And I think just one thing, just to go back to that slide, one thing to just keep in mind is, of course, this is all very selective, right? So it's not like this use of, say, criminal law is happening across the board, right, regardless of what rights are being impinged on or not. So, I think we all know this from our work, right? Like there's, landlords thieve from tenants, landlords lock tenants out, like trespass on tenants, right, go into their apartments, surveil them, lock them out, steal their money in the form of overcharges, commit fraud, do all kinds of things, right? But if were done by other people, would be attract a criminal penalty. But when it's a landlord doing it, it is not deemed to be a criminal activity, right? And so some of this, the way that the state does this is very selective. Cool. So yeah, so now maybe the next slide. Sorry. Okay, and so then, so there's that piece of it, which is like the sort of these laws that enforce private property rights. Then there's like how the state deploys cops, right? Deploys policing. And so what we see is like, policing being deployed in a way that increases landlords' ability to profit, increases gentrification and so forth, right? Builds on gentrification. And so, examples of this are the increased policing of people of color that we, see happening in neighborhoods that are gentrifying, and, particularly that phenomena where you get, like say in public space or in commercial space, things that maybe were acceptable before a neighborhood starts to gentrify once the time comes where the neighborhood is gentrifying, in the course of that cycle that Sam was teaching us about, we see police being deployed in a different way, right, to address things like, I don't know, music and playing dominoes in the street, and different things that were previously perfectly fine and common and culturally appropriate behaviors. There's things like this, like Operations Clean Halls initiative, and other ways that police are used, and police robotic dogs and stuff are used to sort of surveil tenants, and particularly public housing is suffers very deeply from this use of police and policing. And then, of course, a part of this is also the criminalization of homelessness, right? Through things like quality of life offences, right? Things that are sort of necessary, that become necessary when people are homeless, like things like, say, public urination or public, drinking in public, things like that, that are happening in public because people don't have a home. But then become criminalised and offences that are called quality of life offences because they're deemed to be impinging on the quality of life of the people who do have homes in that neighbourhood. Sweeps of homeless encampments, move-alongs of homeless people where police unlawfully profile folks who are homeless and expect them to not be wherever they are and to just move along. So it's another way in which policing is used to manipulate what's going on in neighbourhoods to further the interests of landowners and gentrifiers and so forth. And then, another aspect of it is looking at the way, and I think we can go to the next slide, looking at the way that the state actually, it doesn't just use like the powers that it has, these coercive powers, not just to sort of protect the property itself, but it also uses those powers to protect and guarantee the landlord's ability to profit from the property, right? So it's not just saying to the landlord, I'm going to protect like the physical integrity of your property. It's also saying to the landlord, and I'll protect your ability to make a whole bunch of money off that property. And if there's something I can do for you in terms of enhancing that ability, well, yeah, sure, let's do that too, right? So like the state really does go to bat for landlords, and is using a lot of its apparatus and its monopoly on coercion, its monopoly on legally sanctioned violence to ensure that landlords can profit from property. And one of the key ways that happens is in the context of evictions, right? And so, for all of us, this is our, bread and butter of our work. And what we see is that landlords have access to this like very elaborate system and the backing of the state through this very elaborate system of landlord-tenant law and courts and marshals and all of this to be able to remove tenants from their properties. And why do they want to remove tenants from their properties? They want to remove tenants from their properties when it is no longer profitable for them in some way to keep having those tenants there, when they have determined that removing that tenant will be more profitable than having the tenant stay there, right? So when they deem that their exchange value, right, benefits in some way from being prioritized over that tenant's, home, right, their use value of the property. And so, landlords have access to all of this. And really the thing that's important to remember that is maybe, in some ways less spoken about when you're in these settings is that ultimately the threat is a threat of violence, right? It is a threat of state violence. That if you, the tenant, don't leave or cut a deal with the landlord, or accept the buyout, or, do whatever it is to not be there, or come into compliance, then we, the state, will use our violent forces in the forms of sheriffs and marshals and so forth to make you do it. And we'll physically remove you, right? And so that's like a lot of the power that landlords are wielding when they're in housing court, is that backing of the state, right? That threat that is behind everything else that's happening in those spaces. And I don't know if I have another slide. Sorry, I'm forgetting. No, I don't. But then just to close that out, I mean, obviously, for a really long time, that power that landlords had in those spaces was somewhat unmitigated in a sense, right? Because the vast majority of tenants didn't have lawyers when they were facing off against their landlords, and then there was this threat of violence. And so then, of course, tenants really fought hard to win the right to counsel, which was at least some form of critical intervention that to shift some of those power dynamics. Though, of course, we know that it relies very heavily on all of the organizing that goes on outside of that court setting to make it very powerful, right? To actually really sort of do more to disrupt the source of landlords' power. So I have my last question for the chat, which is, so this is like a twofer, right? So like you can do one or both if you want. So what is an example of the state siding with landlords, and what is an example of the state siding with tenants, right? And you just have to identify which you're saying. So if it's with the landlords, you could put LL or landlord or whatever. If it's to the tenants, you could put T or tenants. You could do both of them if you want. Right, yeah, property tax deductions. Right, the Supreme Court. Now that is a really good example, right? Because we're seeing more and more coming out of the Supreme Court. How the NYPD responds to illegal lockouts, illegal evictions, right? Anytime an eviction is going into court, that's the state saying, yep, we can decide with you, the landlord. I'm going to let you bring this case. Tenants, the right to counsel. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah. And, it's interesting to think about like the right to counsel example. I mean, tenants had to fight really hard to win that, right? It wasn't like the state just went, oh, yeah, cool, we'll do that. That's a good idea. Or thought of it themselves like they do with many of the things for landlords, right? Now, the landlords are off lobbying as well, but there's a way in which, sometimes it's easier for landlords to win the things that they want versus what tenants have to do to get the kind of even just the bare minimum. Marshal's offices, yeah. Yes, a lot of these evictions continuing on, even though there were different moratoria. Yes, the landlords creating that LRAP thing. ERAP's out of money, but hey, landlords, we seem to have found some more. This is just for you. Like, yeah. Evictions, of course. Yes, the state giving up responsibility of public housing, so failing to act for tenants. Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, these are great. Yes, an ERAP is LRAP, exactly. But now there's ERAP, which is LRAP, and LRAP, which is LRAP. So everything is LRAP. So yes, thank you. Absolutely. Thanks, Yvonne. Yeah, courts and the way that they really focused on getting the money flowing to landlords and addressing their cases. Exactly, Christos, thank you. Yeah, the cops again. Yep, thank you, everyone. Okay, so this was really a lot of information, and we really appreciate all of you all paying attention and responding to the questions. We have a little time now for some Q&A if folks would like to ask some questions, and I think we can take questions in the chat if you have them, and if you also want to put stack in the chat, we could call on you if we have time, and you could unmute, but maybe we can just see if there's some questions in the chat for the minute. People are still putting in their responses to the last thing. So, but yeah, feel free, throw in, so if you've got questions, things that we said that caught your interest, or comments, if you have something you want to add to that we missed. Okay. I feel like we overwhelmed you all with our with our presentation because it was really a lot. It's a lot for us. The history of private property is not a happy place. You know, so yeah, we really appreciate all of you all coming. It's great to be amongst kindred spirits.
It certainly is. I do see one question from Melba Cruz in the chat, which is, can landlords ask tenants to leave? The answer is they can ask, but the tenant doesn't need to obey that command. Only a judge can enforce an eviction, and tenants should never self-evict or leave of their own cause or their own fear. They should fight it out.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Cool. So while people are thinking if they have questions, oh, here we go.
Sure. So the question was that I mentioned free market, so-called, wondering if I could expand on that idea a bit. Right. So the reason that I'm putting that in air quotes is the ideal of the free market assumes that the price is just set by, in this case, a landlord based on what a tenant will pay. But the truth is there's a lot of other factors that go into that that are hidden from the tenant's view, certainly, but generally from the public's view, including how many other places do they have to choose from? Is there general conditions of, high vacancy and low costs, in which case, the tenant has a little bit more market power in the situation or not? That's one factor. Another is taxes. Is the landlord getting a tax break that enables them to make more profit off of the housing than not, or are they paying more taxes in part because somebody else is getting a tax break? There's zoning questions about how much can be built in certain areas and how that affects the value of a property. So it's just more complicated than a simple kind of determination of the landlord asks what the landlord wants and the tenant pays it if they can.
Cool. Other questions? And I think at this point, here we go. Something else that's come in from Chapato. Okay. Good question, Sam. I feel like that might be one for you.
Sure, I can start. So to summarize for those who might not see it in the chat, the question is, what did Nixon do basically that changed the role of the state in housing, and how do we move from how do we add a right to housing on top of a right to shelter? So what Nixon did in the early 1970s was basically put a moratorium on the construction of new public housing, and then creating the Section 8 program, which is both has a tenant-based voucher that they can use in private housing or in non-private housing, or a project-based voucher that a developer can use to build housing that has to be affordable for a certain amount of time. And that was a major shift in the idea of what the state is doing. The state is no longer the owner-operator of the housing. They are the financer. And the financing either goes directly to the tenant or it goes to a private developer or possibly nonprofit developer. The nonprofits were just starting to get built up during the previous Johnson administration, and then continued afterward. It doesn't actually get rid of the right to housing. So interestingly, there is a right to housing written into the 1949, I believe, Housing Act. It's just not really enforced or interpreted that way. And of course, we have a right to housing from the United Nations as well. But I guess it was more of a shift in what we were told we should expect from the government, and specifically the federal government. Now, we have a right to shelter in New York City. There is not a right to shelter universally throughout the country. And that right to shelter in New York City, perhaps Marika can get more into, but is a result of a successful lawsuit in the 1980s interpreting the state state charter for New York City as already granting the right to shelter, saying the city shall be responsible for shelter of its residents. Since then, we have had the expansion of the shelter system, which is very important to maintain as a right, but we do not have a right to housing as such, and we need to be fighting for that in a way that doesn't, take away the state's responsibility for shelter as well.
Yeah, and on the shelter question, I mean, it's a really, there's actually, I would encourage you all, there's a city council hearing on the state of single adult homelessness in New York City on Monday morning. So please, like, if you have time, tune into it, because there's going to be a lot of testimony, and I think we're organizing for homeless folks to give testimony. But both homelessness has become, I mean, obviously would agree with everything that Sam said, and just only to be adding on, of course, homelessness has now become an industry through which that has led to landlords making a whole bunch of money by their apartments becoming shelters rather than apartments for permanent housing, and the city paying more than they would have paid for permanent housing for those what we call scatter site, cluster site apartments. That also led to the deregulation of what was previously affordable housing. So the city kind of honoring the right to shelter by using these different ways of enriching private landlords has been a key feature of the right to shelter. And then another key feature of it is, the congregate shelter system, which is incredibly inhumane, violent, degrading, dehumanizing system that penalizes and abuses people for being in a condition of homelessness. That itself has become an industry, right? And so now, the whole situation around the shelter, we have a shelter industrial complex basically, which is now its own industry, and non-profit providers that function as surveillance and abusers and so forth at different times. And so, so it's a really complex and kind of important, I think, aspect of housing to understand homelessness, and all of the ways in which the systems that we have around homelessness interrelate with the kind of systems and exploitation that we have around housing, and particularly along race lines. So I definitely encourage all of you all to dig into that topic as well. I mean, we've really focused much more on tenants and rents and tenancy and housing in that context, but probably a whole other training we should develop is like the one around homelessness, so that folks can sort of see the connection. And then Melba had a question in the chat, which I actually answered in the chat, but just wanted to lift it up. Melba was asking about, can landlords ask tenants to pay sooner so that they can cover their mortgage and so forth? And I think Melba was particularly asking in terms of private houses, is it legal for them to do that? And what I responded in the chat is, a landlord could potentially ask a tenant for that, but really the tenant's only required to pay their rent in the way that's specified in their lease, right? So if that's on the 1st of every month or wherever it might be. And of course, if a landlord is asking for that in a way that is, repeated and intrusive, then that could actually, rise to the level of becoming a form of harassment. So that's something else to keep an eye on there. Miriam is asking about what happens if tenants leave belongings in the apartment and don't go back to pick them up. What can the landlord do? Landlords have an obligation to not immediately dispose of tenants' belongings. They have to hold on to those belongings for 30 days and kind of and store them. I mean, they're not obligated to keep them in the apartment, but they are obligated to hold on to them and to not tamper with them and to not dispose of them. And the tenant is entitled to pick up their belongings. Yeah, although having said that, if the tenant completely vacated the unit, it's a little hard to tell from the situation, but there's lots of different situations around belongings. But that's just a basic answer without going too much into it. And I see here, what is the meeting about homelessness? Oh, so it's actually, Damali, it's not a meeting, it's actually a city council hearing on Monday. that the General Welfare Committee is hosting. So you could see information about it on the City Council website. Any of you all could testify if you want to sign up to testify. And it is a hearing on the state of single adult homelessness in New York City. And the reason, just to explain a little, the reason that it's focused on single adult homelessness is because there is component of the shelter system that is for families. There is a component of the shelter system that is for youth. And the largest numbers of folks who are homeless are single adults in some ways that have access to mostly congregate shelter and really have the least access to sort of apartments that are shelter. A lot of the folks who are street homeless are single adults. So, so that's why that topic has been isolated for a specific hearing. Okay. And, I'm just looking at the time and I think we've run out of time. And I do also see, thank you, Anna, for putting in the link to the hearing in the chat. I do see that there's some different questions around here. One is about disputing rent increases and so forth. But obviously we're starting to get into the realm of beyond maybe political economy of housing and into the realm of sort of general landlord-tenant questions. So, we might run out of time. We might need to call it.
You can always feel free to call Housing Court Answers if you have more specific questions or questions about a particular client in mind. I just wanted to conclude by extending our gratitude to our presenters, Marika and Sam, for a fascinating and I think very informative presentation. I think it was great. It's just very rare to get a presentation that's on, yes, very precise and technical, but still like encompassing a wide range of housing issues. And I also want to announce forthcoming task force meetings. We have a meeting next week, Thursday, December 14th at 3:30 p.m. through 4:30 p.m. on community land trusts as part of a strategy for preservation and the development of affordable housing. So that's somewhat related, I suppose, to this one. As far as developing strategies for preserving public wealth. And we'll also be having a meeting on Tuesday, December 14th on understanding rent histories, MCIs, and individual apartment improvements. So for all of those that are interested, I'm sure most of our participants are already in our listserv. But again, thank you so much. To our presenters. This was great. And I'm looking forward to seeing all of you guys in our next task force meetings. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Thanks, everyone. We'll send through the materials and the reading list and so forth. Send them to Pedro and Jessica, and you guys can set forward them. Bye, everyone.